let's get on to Steve Abel.
Madam Speaker, we have a major challenge in this country that we are losing vast hectareages of farmland to pine forestry. And this is because of a distortion through the emissions trading scheme whereby it is cheaper to offset emissions to pine forestry than to actually cut gross emissions. And for understanding that in a climate change context, the only meaningful way for us to deal with climate change globally is to cut gross emissions, which is real-world emissions. The fiction of offsetting has the same practical impact of an alcoholic paying somebody to drink water and thinking that they have solved their drinking problem. That is the distortion that we have in this country to this day. And the worst, and what's more, the person who's drinking all the water is making a lot of money and thinking that they're doing something about alcoholism, but they're not at all. The worst effect of it is that we are not solving climate change, but actually we're sacrificing some of our least emitting farmland, because a sheep and beef farm produces about a quarter of the emissions of your average high-intensity dairy farm. It seems like the effect we got with He Waka Eke Noa, which sheep and beef were thrown under the bus to protect the dairy industry. That is the distortion that still exists. And to give you an example of one of the worst effects of that is that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment did modelling on the current settings, which showed that by the middle of this century that we're presently in, we could face a situation where land use was dominated by only two types: pine forestry and dairy farms. Now, that is a major challenge for us in terms of our resilience. There's a major challenge for us in terms of the fact that many of those pine forests in the high country will become the tinder dry fuel for future forest fires as the impacts of climate change hit. And let's be clear, the major threat to humanity in terms of climate change is in large part how it impacts our ability to produce food. Globally, erratic seasons, prolonged droughts, greater floods, extreme weather events, these are the things that farmers are on the front line of being impacted by. So a sad denial on the part of the farming industry for some many years of climate change as a problem has actually really undercut farmers and undermined farmers' longevity. We think it's important that the government is acknowledging this problem. I think, however, this bill isn't biting the bullet. The Green Party policy is to remove forestry from the emissions trading scheme, to stop that distortion. That is the actual solution to the problem. The risk with this bill, whilst it is a step in the right direction, and Minister, we will be supporting it to Select Committee because we want to see it developed more thoroughly. And we would actually like to see it given the proper time it deserves, because there are some real risks with it. One is that there's a risk that you actually get, with the ballot system, a continued loss of that land, that high country land. I note that Kate Ackland from Sheep and Beef said that Land Class 6 is the foundation of our breeding farms. 15,000 hectares every year coming out of this will add up over time. Toby Williams from Federated Farmers, there is a huge amount of land going into pine trees. That's what farmers will currently be using as breeding country. We can't afford to lose 150,000 hectares in the next decade. The other distortion that we risk is that where you have adjacent bits of land, one that might be dominated by Land Class 6, where you won't be allowed to plant pines except through the ballot, and another dominated by Land Class 7, it could be that you invert the value of those land areas, whereby the Land Class 7 becomes higher value because you can now plant pine trees on it. That's another unhelpful distortion. What is more, farmers, and we hear this all the time, need the ability to have long-term planning in their land use. Being in a lottery to know whether they can plant a forest is the opposite of giving certainty to farmers in terms of how they can plan their land use. The other thing that's exciting happening in the sector is the likes of agroforestry and silvopasture and tree intercropping. These things are not recognised for their valuable use of combinations of diverse, mosaic landscapes where you're planting trees and you're raising livestock and you're producing crops and food. I don't see that this bill addresses those challenges. I look forward to debating it at the Select Committee. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Now, that's actually quite interesting. I love it how Steve Abel's on the money of we're going to end up having farming of two things. Forestry and dairy farms.
Yeah. I'm just reading through the regulatory impact statement. It's very interesting, but some of the data presented in it seems to match the sheep and beef report that I was referring to before. So I'm not too far off the mark there when it comes to the numbers. So that's good to know. So not too much fake news, guys. We can only a little bit of fake news. Why am I laughing at my own jokes? Right, it is very interesting that Steve Abel wants to take this to Select Committee. Personally, I would have just voted it down because it's like, what the hell is this ballot system? Please explain.
They probably, put it this way, you've had much more time to read the information as it's been available than what they did, as it was a bill that was put under urgency, an urgency motion that was not made available to read beforehand.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Being open-minded, you probably want to see it to go to Select Committee, and this one isn't skipping the Select Committee process.
That is true, yeah.
So that is partly, I think, why. It'll be interesting to see where the party Māori is when Hannah comes up later on in the show.
Yeah, I get it. Steve Abel wants to flex his muscles and debate everyone. I get that. I completely understand the desire to do that. So I look forward to Select Committee.
Yeah. Okay, let's get on to... this speech seems to have ministers galore.